Okay, let's pick up right where we left off. We have all of our lights set up in our scene, and it's actually looking pretty good even without any textures applied. But now the time has finally come to add some textures to our scene. And I'm going to keep these relatively simple. We're not going to do, any node networks that are much more complicated than what you see right here for our sign emission. But I mean, even by keeping them simple, it's going to add a lot to our scenes. So we can go for something like this to something like this. And that's what we're going to work towards today. We probably won't get to this little holographic image, and we probably won't cover the kind of hazy, foggy, volumetric world shader, but we'll do a lot of other things. So we're going to be using image-based textures. You can get some similar effects for some textures with procedural textures, just using, for instance, the built-in noise and Musgrave and wave and all sorts of those. And there's a ton of great tutorials out there on procedural textures, but we're going to use image-based textures. And to do that, we need images. Now, it's easy enough to find a photo of a brick wall, for instance, but it doesn't mean that that photo is going to be good for texturing. There's a couple of considerations that we want to keep in mind. So I'm going to pull up first a couple of resources here. And the first, and I'll try to remember to link these in the video description. This website, artisticrender.com, has a great list of free or Creative Commons textures that we can use. So thank you, Eric, for all of this. He's also got some other great write-ups on his site, so definitely check out the site in general. But for this video, I'm really mostly focused on this page. And he's got some a number of sites here. Textures 1 is a search engine for textures. And then he's got individual sites laid out. My favorites are actually these first three underneath it. Texture Haven, which is a similar website. It's the same group of websites as HGRI Haven, which I know I've mentioned before. CC0 Textures and CG Bookcase. They've all got great things, but if we go to textures and look at the bricks first, and I'm going to look at this texture right now. And I want to look at just the diffuse. So this is just going to be what goes in the color channel. I'm just going to download the 1K, just the smallest file, because I just want this as an example. Okay, so here's what that texture looks like. And there's a couple of things that you're going to notice here. The first is that this is a tileable texture. This is a seamless texture. What that means is if I go in here, I'm going to go to my material preview, and I'm just going to focus on just this street. So we're just going to use the street as our example. And let's see, let's give it a new material, and we will call this just a demo material, because it's just going to be a throwaway. We're not actually going to use it. But if we drag our image texture in and connect up the color, we can hit Control-T to bring up our mapping node. Yeah, so now we've got all of the controls that we need. And we can adjust the scale. And so if I set the scale to 2, it's going to duplicate that twice across. And we can see, or actually we can't see, any seams. It's not obvious where that texture is repeated, which is great. That's a very good thing for textures that need to cover large areas. And we can bring this up. Now, as I bring this up even further, now you're going to start to see that repetition. And if you look at any video games from like the N64 era, when they first started doing 3D and the file sizes had to stay super low, you're going to notice a lot of repeating patterns in grass. It's because of this. They're tiling the same texture multiple times throughout the scene. So it is a seamless texture, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to notice repetition. So keep that in mind. And there are ways you can hide it. You can add additional grunge and dirt and grime over the top of it. When a big open space, you're going to notice it, but if we're putting a bunch of junk on the wall in front of it, it's going to make it less obvious, so that can work to our favor. But another thing to notice with this texture, and I'll go back to 2, I think that's a good size, is that this image has lighting information built in. Okay, and we don't really want that. When we're dealing with PBR shading, physically based rendering, that's what PBR stands for. One of the kind of principles or guidelines for this method, which has become kind of the standard over the last 5 to 10 years, is that the color maps, sometimes called albedo, and really I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that albedo requires that no lighting information be baked into the color map. And that's just generally good practice. We can see in this image, if we zoom in here, we can see there are shadows underneath the bricks. Okay, and so what that does is it kind of bakes in or infuses in that image lighting information, which if you want a slightly overcast day brick wall with even lighting, then this would work. But if you don't want that, if you want a light underneath in your scene, the image is still going to have that light underneath, and it's going to look weird. You're going to get competing shadows, and it's going to ruin the illusion of reality. So what might be a better option is, let's see, if we go to CC0 Textures, I believe has a good one. Got some, it's not really a brick. I'll go to CG Bookcase. Here we can just go to Textures, and we can search for brick. And let's see if we've got something here. Okay, so here is our color map with very minimal, I guess there's still a little bit, but it's pretty minimal lighting information involved. And I think CC0 Textures had a really good example of this. Yeah, okay, here we go. And this is actually the one that I'm going to use for the scene. But this is a brick color texture with no shadows whatsoever. Okay, and this is great because that means however we light it, it's not going to cast competing shadows. Okay, now this image isn't square, and generally you want square textures because it just makes everything easier to work with. But it's not always required. As you can see here, I'm going to use a non-square texture, but I encourage you to use square textures. Okay. So no lighting information in the color map and square textures. Let's talk about texture size. If we look here, this brick texture, we can download textures at size of 1K or at 2K. And if we go over here, we have 1K, 2K, 4K, and 8K, which is huge. All right, we can have, if we downloaded the PNG, it would be almost 400 megabytes, which is pretty crazy. So what size should we use? The general rule that I've heard is you want the texture size to be twice the size of your final render. Okay, so if you're going to be rendering at 1080, you'd want to at least have a 2K texture. If you're rendering at like 1440, you'd want at least a 4K texture. I believe that's how it goes. Practically speaking, we're not worried about real-time rendering. We're not worried about game development here, which has its own requirements. I'm going to ignore that. I have no experience in game development, so I'm not the person to come to for that sort of information. But as far as what we're concerned with, a single scene still renders. We still don't want to use the highest quality for everything, because if we load our scene up with 8K textures, and remember, each material that we set up isn't going to have just one image. It's not just going to have the diffuse image. It's also going to have a normal map and a roughness map, perhaps a metallic or a metalness map, and maybe even a displacement map. So if we're having 4, 5, 6 textures, and each one is, 300 megabytes, then we're going to very quickly slow down Blender in terms of RAM, video RAM, which I'm already getting close to my graphics card. That's because I'm also recording. And the render times are going to go way up. So what I would say is use the smallest texture that you can while still getting enough detail that you need. All right, so for a lot of things, we'll probably be fine with 2K textures. For very large areas, for instance, this street, because that texture is going to be spread out over a large area, then I'll go with a 4K texture. For very small things, for instance, this nut and bolt right here, I might use a 1K texture, or even 512 by 512. Because most likely, the camera's never going to be right here. This is not an interesting shot. Okay? This is kind of an interesting shot, but you can see how small that one bolt is compared to everything else in the frame. Another thing with textures, when I say square textures, we're also keeping them in powers of 2. So texture sizes, video games used to, the textures would get as small as like 32 by 32 or 64 by 64. And then you get 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, and then is it 8192 is 8K. So I want to say in powers of 2 is just the most efficient way to work. All right, I think that's it as far as kind of the basics that we need to cover for textures. Now we can start finding and using them. Okay, actually, there's 2 more things that I want to cover. I just checked my notes. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. I'm talking about Pbr textures, or physically based rendering. And there's a couple of different ways or workflows for this. There's a metallic roughness workflow, and then there's a specular workflow. Blender uses a metallic roughness workflow. Okay, we've got this metallic slider right here. So that's what we're going to be using, is metallic roughness workflow. And some texture sites will allow you to choose between a specular workflow or a metallic roughness. For instance, Andrew Price's website Polygon, spelled with 2 I's and no Y. Okay, this is a paid site for textures. But if we look at his textures, you have the option to download either a or at least on some of them, you have the option to download either a specular roughness or a metallic roughness workflow, I believe. Okay, he's got a couple of free ones. Like here's the wood floor that I showed earlier on the box. I believe this was the website that had an option between specular roughness and metallic roughness, or specular versus metallic roughness. You can see you've got various texture sizes we can choose as well. Might have been a different site that I was thinking of. It's got a bunch of great textures here too, including some free ones that are nice to check out as well. I suppose he's pretty Blender oriented, so maybe he didn't have the specular roughness. That's one thing we want to make sure we keep in mind when you're looking for texture sets. You should most likely see a metalness map included. You don't want one that has specular. You can kind of convert between the two, but not well and not accurately. But the sites that I'm showing you will have all of the correct kind of workflow. And it really just, it varies as far as what maps that we see. So you see, if we go to this brush iron, we got a base color, we've got a metallic texture, a normal map, and a roughness. So that's what we want to see. And then sometimes you'll see a displacement or a height map. The last thing to note is with normal maps. And this is something that we'll see when we actually start applying textures. But with normal maps, there's 2 different ways of processing it. And there's a link if we go to the on CG Bookcase, and I'll post a link in the description for this as well. He kind of lays this out, but basically there's 2 different ways that normal maps are made, and it depends on if you're using a DirectX system or if they're created with direct or for DirectX or for OpenGL. Blender uses OpenGL. A lot of other things use DirectX. It's not, just Blender that uses OpenGL. I think Unity does as well. Could be wrong on that, but other, common applications use OpenGL as well. What that means, practically speaking, is that we can't just directly plug our normal map into a normal map node. We have to invert the green channel of the normal map. Okay, so if you remember, the normal map is a vector map. Okay, and it's using the colors to tell the light which way to bounce in X, Y, and Z space. Well, one of those channels, the green channel, is inverted depending on if you're using DirectX or OpenGL. So we just need to remember that when we're downloading normal maps, if it looks weird, we need to invert the green channel. I can also say, thankfully, both CG Bookcase and CC0 Textures, if you actually get into, I believe you go into Help, somewhere on the website, yeah, using the assets, and you can see right here, they've got their own section too, DirectX versus OpenGL style normal maps. So it talks about why it happens and how you can fix it. Okay, so check the website, and they'll usually call out which one the maps are made for, and if you need to reverse it. In this case, CC0 Textures and CG Bookcase, both you need to reverse the normal maps. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If your normal map is looking weird, there's a good chance that that's an issue. Okay, that's all of the talking off the top. Let's add a texture. So I have a texture library that I've started developing. I just put it in a Blender folder, and just all the textures that I download, I'm putting in their own folders in this texture library. I'm not putting it in my Cyberpunk scene project folder. This way, when I start a new project, I can still use these textures, and it's in a centralized location. I don't have to go and pull textures from different projects. So I have some already downloaded, some we might browse and download later. That's fine. So let's grab the ground, and we're going to start with this one. So here, to add a texture set, and this was one that I pulled from almost certainly pulled from CC0 Textures. So if we go to our categories, and we have somewhere in here, we've got road as a category, which is nice. And I believe on CC0 Textures, I'm pretty sure most of these were developed with Substance Designer. So you'll see, you can probably download the Substance files as well. But we've got this one right here. So we've got kind of a beat-up road. Take a second to load the preview. We've got kind of a beat-up road with some patches and some yellow lines. And I like the yellow lines better than the white lines. I think it works better in the scene. I downloaded the 4K JPEGs. I'll take JPEGs over PNG. It's fine. It's good enough for this, especially, recording it and streaming it over the internet. You're getting enough compression, you're not going to see the difference. So I use the 4K. Again, it's a big open area. It might be helpful to have that extra space. So to add those textures, first thing we need to do is create a material for it. Right, I'm going to collapse the preview area here, and we can hit the X to get rid of the demo, click New, and I'm going to call this Asphalt. We'll say Road Asphalt. That'll work. Okay. So we've got that. Now we need to bring our textures in. Now we can click and drag them all in, but with Node Wrangler enabled, and once again, just as a reminder, if you're jumping into this out of order, go to your add-ons, type in Node, and make sure you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. It is bundled with Blender by default, and check autosave preferences so that it stays on. Okay. So with that enabled, what we can do is we can select our principled BSDF node, hit Control-Shift-T, and then this is going to bring up our file browser. We can go to our texture library, and I have this asphalt right here, and I've got a 2K and a 4K version. I'm going to go with the 4K version. And then we've got our maps. So I'm going to click and drag and select all of them, and then click Principled Texture Setup. And what that's going to do, and this is pretty great, is that it adds all of our image textures. It also adds our mapping nodes, connects everything up, and then it adds the normal map and the displacement nodes that we need to use those textures, saving a bunch of time. Now, I'm not going to use a displacement node for the road, or at least if I do, it'll be later, so I'm going to disconnect that. In the testing, it wasn't really having as much of an impact as I would have liked, and frankly, I'd rather make the render happen a little bit faster than what the road was happening, because we're not going to be focusing on the road. So I'm going to leave it in the network for this, because there's still a possibility I'll use it, but I'm not going to have it hooked up. Now, we have all of our textures. Now, one thing to make sure is sometimes the textures don't load right. Okay, sometimes you get the wrong textures loaded in. It seems to happen most often with either the metallic or the roughness, but it's always a good idea just to hover over your textures and check to make sure that you've got the right file name in there. I've got you can see at the bottom there it says value road 003 4K color.jpg.001. That's because I already have a road texture in here. So that's actually even already in place. But I'm just going to go through the whole new process setup. So we're going to hover over it, just make sure that that says color at the end. So we've got the color texture in that channel. And for the color, we need the color space to be sRGB, which it is. And it's hooked up to the right one. For the roughness, you see that the file name is the roughness file, and the color space is non-color. That's important. Same thing with the normal. It says normal and non-color. And displacement, it says displacement. Again, sometimes it'll say height, and then non-color. All right, so normal map. Or actually, before we do that, let's position our texture. Okay, so we're just going to focus on this mapping node. Orbit our view around here. Okay, I'm going to temporarily turn off my scene overlays. Now, we know we want the road to be running the other way, so we need to rotate it 90 degrees. So I'll set the Z rotation to 90. Okay, that's good. And now we need to move it out, so we can grab the X, oops, hold down Shift so it just moves a little bit. And I'm going to put what I assume is a bike lane kind of right up against the curb a little bit. And now we need to adjust the size. I want to see that middle stripe going through. It can also be very useful to turn our meta rig back on. And we need to have overlays on in order to see him, I believe. There he is. And we can kind of move him out into the street, just to get a sense of relative size and scale. So if you think about the average foot size compared to the average width of a street like line, this is actually looking pretty good. We might not actually have to do too much here. Yeah, so I think the position is all right. I kind of want to scale it down a little bit, just because I want to see that center line. So let's grab that street again, and grab the scales, hold down Shift and drag. Then we can move this back over. Okay, now we're seeing that center line. And that feels all right. We can maybe try like 1.28. Yeah, okay, I think that's going to work. I don't know how much we're actually going to see that center, but that works for me. And then if we want, looking at the kind of the patchwork pattern in the road, we can shift it in the Y direction, kind of decide if we want a dark patch maybe in the center of the spotlight. Kind of move that over until we get a dark patch there. Maybe something like that. Okay, so now we've got everything hooked up. So if we go into rendered view, it should be looking pretty good. You can see what happens when we add that shading. It's going to take a second to render. And yeah, it looks all right. We can go back to our material preview. I can turn on scene world, and now we're going to see something a little bit more accurate. So you kind of, it's not perfectly accurate, but it's close. We can also just change the HDRI here to something that's going to more accurately represent our final lighting. And so this is why I loaded in this custom HDRI, because it's going to be useful just for this scenario. Okay, so that's good. Now if we zoom in here, let's actually go over this way. We can even, I don't think this view is going to show it too well. But we can hit Control B and do a bordered render here. Go into our rendered view. It's just going to render this region. Now, as I was saying, with the normal maps, is that oftentimes we need to invert them. So let's do that now. Okay, and this can be kind of tricky to see on this material. When we do the sidewalk, it'll be even more obvious. So I'm going to just zoom right in here, go to material preview, because it'll still show up here. And what we need to do is we need to add between the normal map, or the normal map image and the normal map node, we need to add in a color, oops, Shift A, color, and RGB Curves node. So we're going to add that. Nothing's going to happen right away. We need to go to the green channel here and just flip the angle of the curve. So we're going to bring the left side all the way up and the right side all the way down. That's it. Okay. That's all we did. And I don't know if you can see that it worked, but I promise that it worked. Focus here and see if we can't get a nice angle. Maybe we'll grab this. Okay, so you can see that we're getting some highlights here on the street. So if we watch how these highlights respond, we've got this curve node right here. We can mute this node with M. So I'm just going to hit M to mute it and unmute it. Okay, so we can kind of see how that changes when we disable it and when we enable it. It just makes everything go in the correct direction. So there's our road. That's basically done. If you want, one thing you can do, just to kind of see what each channel is doing, is if we Control-Shift-Click on each node, here is just the color. Okay, you can see no light difference. I'm going to go back to an HDRI with a strong light source, because that can help kind of see the effects here. So this is just the color. We Control-Shift-Click on Roughness. This is just the roughness. Remember, white is one that's going to be more rough. Okay, so that's working. And then we can go, here's the normal map. All right. And this is perhaps even easier to see the difference with inverting the green channel. So I'll mute it again. Oh, we need to actually shift-click on the normal map. Okay. So here's with it disabled, and you can see that the street, like the road line, seems to go in. And then we hit M, and now it's bumping out more. Might be easier to see here. I know it's a tough thing to show, especially on a screen recording. So mute. Okay. See how that flips. That's the normal map, and then again the displacement map we're not using, so I'm not going to worry about it. All right, so I'm going to Control-Shift-Click on our principled node here to get back to everything. And now we can see we've got some highlights on the road, some nice variation there, and I'm happy. All right, let's move on to the sidewalk, because this is going to add one additional step. We're going to talk about displacement here. So let me get rid of the UV test grid on this object. Click New, and I'm going to call this one Sidewalk. Okay. And hit Control-Shift-T. Got my texture library right here. And I believe, I don't remember which one this is, but I found a good kind of stone hexagonal pattern that I really liked. Heaving Stone Hex, there we go. This is another one that I'm going to go at 4K because it does cover a fairly large area, and it's got a lot of detail that I want to include. So this one has 5 maps. It's got an ambient occlusion one, which is great for real-time calculations. We're using cycles to render, so we don't need to worry about ambient occlusion. But we do have a color, a displacement, a normal map, and a roughness. So I'll select those 4 and click Principled Texture Setup, and that's going to bring it in. Now, by default, it's huge. And we can move our little stand-in back there. So, yeah, by default, it's huge. So we need to adjust that scale. We can also see, it looks like these indentations are actually bumping out. So we need to reverse the normal map for sure. Let's do that first. And I'm going to kind of cheat here. I'm just going to select my road, select my RGB curve node, hit Control-C to copy. then select my sidewalk, hit Control V to paste, and then click and drag it on top of the connection between the normal and the normal map, and add that. And now it looks correct. And again, we can toggle the mute on that node so you can see the difference. Especially look at this seams between each tile. Without the reverse, it looks like they're kind of sticking up versus the correct orientation. Okay, so that's great. Let's adjust our mapping here. So we need to bring that scale down. And I don't remember what the correct... No, that's too small. Although, I mean, that works. There's no reason why this doesn't work. I want something a little bit larger. So let's try 3.4. That's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Okay. And then I want to slide this over a little bit, just because if we look at the seam with the curb, I don't like seeing just a little bit there. So I'm going to grab the Y direction, hold down Shift, and just slide it over a little bit. Maybe something like that works. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay. So there is our sidewalk laid out. I'm going to really quickly just check all of my textures here and make sure we have paving stone. Yep, we've got the color map there, and it's set to sRGB. We've got the roughness is... so let's make sure we have... Yep, we've got the roughness, non-color. We know the normal map is working. And then we've got our displacement map, which we will end up using. The other thing to note with our principled setup, we're not going to push these sliders around too much, but I do want to look at the index of refraction. And then for solid objects, I'm going to set it to 1.6. So most solid objects are going to be right around there. Okay. And then we have the metallic is set to 0 for both of these because there's no metal involved. All right. So now that we have that, let's look at that rendered view. I really love how this texture works, and I love how the light reflects off of it. This is a cool one if we Control-Shift-Click just on the roughness, so we can see what the roughness is doing. See the seams between them are almost pure white, so that's going to be pretty extreme there. Not going to reflect a whole lot of light. These darker areas are going to be shinier. So we'll go back to our principled output, and that's what we're getting. But we can take this one step further, and that's with using the displacement node. Okay, so up till now, we haven't talked about displacement really. We've just been using normal maps to get some of that micro surface detail. And it looks like there's different kind of surfaces, but the closer we get to flat here, the more you can tell that there is absolutely no difference in the surface of the tiles. And so a displacement map will allow us to do that. There's a couple of ways to do a displacement map in Blender. One way is you can actually use a displacement modifier. So we can choose displace, and we can click a new to create a new texture. And then we can go to our texture options and choose our paving stone displacement. In that way. But we can also do it just in the shader node tree. And that's the way that I'm going to do it. So I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to get rid of the displacement modifier. Okay, so we've got displacement. It's hooked up by default. And I'm just going to move this over here so we can focus just on these two nodes. And really, it's just the displacement node that we need to worry about. So in order to get this to work, we need to change a few settings. The first is we need detail in the mesh. If we go into edit mode right now, see it's just one big plane. So first I am going to add just a couple of subdivisions, just a few. So let's do that. Okay, so these are roughly square. Okay, just so there's a little bit of extra. And we can even go into the top, select everything, and re-unwrap it if we need to. We can just project from view because it's just a flat plane. Then hit Q and back the islands and make sure that we're not rotating. And we're good. Okay. But that's still not going to be enough detail, because what this is going to do is it's going to take the, just go to our displacement image here, and let's actually just look at the, let's not look at the displacement node, let's look at the displacement texture itself. We've got this grayscale image, and what it's going to do is it's going to figure out what is the value at each point, at each pixel, and it's going to push the geometry at that location either up or down depending on the value. So 50% gray is not going to move at all by default, and that's what this mid-level is here in displacement. 0 is going to push down, and 1 is going to push up. Okay. So in order for that to work, we're going to need more geometry than just the 18 faces that we have here. Now we can add a subsurface modifier. And we can go way up high with that, even if we go simple and you know, do 6 subdivisions. And that's going to start to work, but it's going to get really heavy in our scene. We don't want that. So what we can do is we can use a subsurface modifier that is adaptive. Okay, so let me add it, and then I'll talk about what that means. To do this, this is actually an experimental feature, so we need to go to our Render Settings tab, or Render Properties tab, and for feature set, we need to go to Experimental. Now, it's saying that some features in Experimental are incomplete, might be broken. The one that we're going to be using has been around for a while. It's pretty stable. It actually should get moved to the main trunk, as far as I understand, relatively soon. But we're going to go to Experimental, and then we're going to go back to our modifiers, add a subsurface modifier. And we've got a new option. It's adaptive subdivision. I'm also going to set this to simple because I don't want it to round the corners. That's good. Okay. Actually, I'm going to leave it on Catmull Clark, and I'm just going to really quickly add some holding edges because it's really fast to do, and I would just prefer it that way. So easy enough. We'll make them pretty tight. Add that one there. Add that one there. Cool. Get out a local view. And one thing we're going to notice if we zoom in here, we can see a gap between the curb and the sidewalk. So we actually need to go a little bit further here. I'm going to grab this whole front edge, and I'm going to hit E to extrude and move it down a little bit. Just a little bit to create that holding edge in here. Go into wireframe, you can see that. Okay. And then I'll hit E to extrude and Z and go down a little bit further. Okay, so now we've got a little bit of an edge there, a little bit of a lip. Click Shade Smooth. And that's going to just look better and more realistic. All right, and then we'll need to unwrap this again. Actually, let's see how the material works on the side. You can see it's stretched, but this kind of works. One, we're not going to see all the way down, but the tiles, we don't want the tiles to kind of move around the side. So this works well enough. I'm not going to re-unwrap it. I'm going to leave that stretching in there. And you can see with that enabled, we can't really see in there. So it's not that big of a deal. Although we may want to add, just sharpen that up a little bit more. Okay, great. So back to our displacement modifier. So we've got our subdivision surface. We can turn on adaptive subdivision, and what that does is it changes our options here. Adaptive subdivision will divide and subdivide the surface based on how close it is to the camera or how large it is on camera. It relies on pixels and not polygons. Okay, so instead of evenly dividing everything, it's going to be basing this off of pixels. And so we have a dicing scale. In the viewport, it's going to do every 8 pixels, but at render time, it's going to do every pixel. And we can change that as necessary. I'm going to set the viewport render to 4. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to do. That's going to give us the density of geometry that we need, but because it's adaptive, it's going to be relatively efficient, all things considered. So we have that. We can check our rendered view, and not really anything is going to happen. We want it to happen, but it's not quite there yet, because there's still another thing that we need to do. And that's going to be in our material settings, our material properties. Scroll down to displacement, and actually it's in settings. Yep, in settings, we have this displacement option, and by default it's set to bump only. I'm going to set that to either, you can choose either displacement only or displacement and bump. I'll do displacement and bump. Okay, so we do that, and now, holy buckets, this is what we get. Okay, and so that is a lot, and it's working. It only works in rendered view, by the way. If I go to material preview, you don't see any effect. So we do need to see this in rendered view. But that looks like there's been some terrible calamity happen to this sidewalk. So we need to bring down that scale. So for scale, I'm going to set this 0.03. Maybe as soon as this kicks in. 0.03. Maybe. You can see this will start slowing down Blender a bit. Oh, you know what it is? I hit my number lock key. That's what was going on, 0.03. There we go. I'm also going to hit save, because it's always a good thing to save. Save early, save often. All right, so we're back to camera view. I'm going to hit Control-Alt-B to clear my bordered region. And we can kind of rotate this around. And now we can see our sidewalk. So that is with displacement, and then without displacement. Okay, so I'm going to let this render here for a second without displacement. I'll take a screenshot. See, we're at about halfway through this path replacing render. That's probably good enough. So we'll just grab that area right there, and then we'll open up our snapshot. For whatever reason, it decided it didn't want to open up in dark mode. It's annoying, because I would prefer dark mode. All right, whoops. Whoops. Need that back. Give me that back. It's gone forever. Okay. There we go. So here's our snip. Here's without displacement, and then with displacement. And we'll let that load for a second. Okay, but you can see, I mean, here's a pretty obvious area. But even over here, you can see, and it just gives more life to that sidewalk. It really does, and it's a very quick way to add that amount of detail without having to do any texturing or sculpting, or excuse me, with having to texture, without having to do any sculpting or just very intense modeling. So displacement maps are fantastic, but they take resources, they take memory to do. So I'm not going to use them on everything. I'm only going to use them on the pieces that really need it. Speaking of pieces that really need it, this garage door is another great example of where we can use displacement. So let's go to our materials here. And we'll get rid of the UV test grid, add a new material, and we'll call this garage. That's not how you spell garage. G-A-R-A-G-E. There we go. Garage door. Capitalize that. So it's going to bother me if I don't. And there we see we have our principal shader node here. I'm going to set the IOR to 1.6. And let's grab some textures. So the textures that I used, I believe I also pulled from CC0 textures. I think I did. Let's go to categories here. Oh, we're already in categories. Let's see, metal. Maybe not. Maybe I pulled them from CG Bookcase. Go to textures. And over here we can choose metal. We scroll down. Yep. Okay, so this is the one that I chose. It's corrugated metal panel. We look at it, see it's a 2K texture, which is plenty for what we need. So I'm going to, in my shader editor, Control-Shift-T, navigate to my corrugated metal, corrugated steel. Here it is. Again, we have ambient occlusion we don't need. We do have color, displacement, metalness, normal, and roughness. So I'm going to select that one, shift select the last one, it selects all 5, and import our principal texture set. Okay, so familiar node setup. First thing, let's just go through and make sure that everything is correct. So, yep, that's the color texture, color space sRGB. We've got the metalness. This one is, yep, it's listed as the metalness, non-color. And here we have our roughness. Is roughness, non-color. Normal, works. And displacement is the displacement. Great. So we got that all working. We know we need to invert our normal map. So let's do that right away. And we don't even need to look at it to know we need to do that. So let's go down here. Shift-A, add in a color Rgb Curves. Pop that right on there. Go to the green channel and change the slope. There we go. That's working. Next up, the lines are running in the wrong direction. So I'm going to go to the mapping node here. And I'm just going to rotate this in the Y direction, I believe, 90 degrees. Nope, not that direction. The Z direction, 90 degrees. There we go. Okay, so that's the correct orientation. Now we can adjust the scale. I'm going to drag down across. And let's see. Let's try... We'll just try 2. That might be a little bit much. 0.8. We can bring our little stand in here over, standing next to it. Yeah, I think that's going to work. Good enough for now anyway. It's easy enough to change these if we need to. So we've got that. And let's check out rendered view. All right, looking pretty good. And we can see even that normal map is creating some nice stark shadows on it, which I love. But if we get up close to it, we can tell that that's still flat. So this is another time where I think the displacement is really going to be worth it. So we can do the same thing that we did before. We're going to, with that door selected, we're going to go to our material properties, scroll down to settings, and set the displacement to displacement and bump. And then we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier, turn on adaptive sampling, and quickly go into solid view. And it looks like we need to, we need to give it a little bit of extra detail. So let's add in 2 here, scale them apart to create our holding edges, add in 2 here, scale them in the Z direction, create our holding edges there. Okay, see, I just a little bit right there. And then I'm also going to just add 3 in each direction. Okay, so we have that. And I'm just going to, we look at our unwrap, we can see that we need to make some changes here. So I'm just going to project from view, hit Q, and pack the islands, make sure rotate is off. And that's looking better. Okay, back to texture. Get out of local view here, get out of object, or get out of edit mode. And there we go. So if we go back to our rendered view, we're going to see that our displacement modifier is in fact working, but it is looking more like razor blades or vents than it is a door. And that's once again because the displacement is just huge. So let's bring that scale back down to 0.03 and see how that works. We might need to go higher than that. That's a good starting point. Let's see. We can go into local view here too and turn off the scene world. Get a better sense of how much this is actually moving. Again, you can see that this is how much the displacement modifier is actually moving the vertices. I'm also going to make sure we're on shade smooth. There we go, that's better. Yeah, I think that actually feels about accurate. 0.03 is not always going to be the right number, by the way. I know it's been correct twice in a row. It's not always going to be the right number, but it just happens to work out for us in this instance. And then we're not going to see the end, so we don't really need a solidify modifier, but, you know, as potential that you could, I don't know actually how well this is going to work with the displacement modifier. Even, and one, this might not actually work. I've never tried a displacement modifier with this, so I'm not going to do it. We don't need it anyway. I was just curious. All right, so we'll get out of local view. Oh, when we will rotate around the backside. And there's our displacement modifier. We can go back to our scene world. It's going to look more accurate. Now those shadows are really nice and deep. We can look at our rendered view here. And I think we're getting some really great results on that. Let that render for a second. We can kind of appreciate our work. So we've only added 3 texture sets, and it's already feeling great. I'm really happy with that. So let's do a few more. I'm not going to do every object in the scene because I don't want to do a 4-hour video, but we'll do a few more, and I'll try to cover most of the bases. Like I said, this is just going to be basic texturing. Yeah, so let's just keep going. All right, next up, let's do this big wall right here. Okay, so we're gonna grab this wall, and same deal as before. Let me also check. I might have been lazy before and not add. Okay, so I think we're good there. Making sure we had the right geometry there. All right. Materials. And get rid of the UV test grid. Add in a new material, and we will call this wall underscore. Actually, so there's kind of 2 ways that you can go about naming your materials. You can name them by object or name them by what the material is. I kind of go back and forth, and I would love to hear some opinions on this and try to find some professional best practices because I don't actually know the answer to this, but I kind of go back and forth. I'm going to try to remember to just name the materials what the actual material is, because if I name this metal wall and then decide that I actually want it to be brick, then metal wall doesn't really apply. So I could name it right wall, but that's not really descriptive as to what the material is. So I'm going to name it metal tiles, because I know that's the material that I'm going to add, and whether or not it gets applied to this wall, we'll see. But so that's the way that I'm going to go with this. Let's find our nodes here. There they are. And I'm good with the principle. We don't have to change that. Let's bring in our materials. Now this one, try to find where I pulled this from. I believe I pulled this one from CC0 Textures. So we go back to our categories and let's see. Got an interesting pipe texture there. Let's see, where would it be? Would it be in metal? Nope, it's not metal. I don't believe it's in tiles. No, you can see there's a wide variety of options that we have here. Metal plates. Nope, it's not that either. Well, I found it on the internet for sure. Maybe I did find it in CG Bookcase. CG Bookcase is the most recent website that I found, and I've kind of fallen in love with it. It's got some really great options, especially for some like grungy stuff. That's similar to what it is, but it's not that exact one. I don't know where it went. Must have been here. Let me just go back to assets and we'll search for metal. Let's see, we've got a bunch of tiles. Might have been a less commonly used one. No. Okay, I don't know where it came from, but I'm using it. We can try textures.1. We can do a wide search for it. Just wanted to show you where it came from. Here it is. Yeah, it is from CG Bookcase. Okay, I don't know why it didn't show up in the search then. But that's where I got it from. And I believe I used the 4K again. As far as which one you should use, I know it's a pretty big space, so I'd probably use the 4K as well. But you can also get away with 2K. I've got a pretty healthy system, computer system, so I'm going to take advantage of it. But this is what I downloaded. Let's add it to our scene. So Control-Shift-T, navigate to my metal tiles, which is going to be... which one is it? Is it... Let me just click on the base color. Thin stainless steel tiles. Oh, it might be... Oh, that's not it. Is it under thin? It is. There it is. Thin stainless steel tiles. So we have a color map, a height map, which is also displacement, a normal map, and roughness. Okay, so let's grab all of them and bring them in. Now this is one I did do some testing, and the displacement map really didn't do a ton for me, so I'm going to not use the displacement. So first thing, I'm just going to select that displacement node and just hit X to delete it. But I do want to take a look at these real quick. So this is the base color. Okay. And then let's look at the height map. You see it's black and white for the height map. I'm just thinking about using this as a metallic, because this doesn't have a metallic texture. But I don't really want the seams, the grout lines, if you will, to be metallic. So I might use the displacement map as metallic map. We'll see how it goes. All right, first let's double check our nodes, because this doesn't look quite right. We zoom into the base color, hover over it, we can see that it is the base color. That's good. The roughness, we hover over this, and it is roughness. Hover over the normal map. That is normal. Our displacement we're not worried about at the moment. Okay. So we know these are metal tiles, so let's just bring this metallic all the way up to 1. And that's looking better already. We can kind of zoom in on our grout lines. And you know what? They're rough enough that I think we're probably okay. However, the normal map needs to be reversed, so we'll do that again. So move those nodes over, zoom in here, Shift-A, color, Rgb Curves, go to the green channel, and reverse it. Really fast, really simple. Makes things look better. Okay, so we've got that. Now let's worry about repetition and placement, kind of figure out where we want this to be. So let's adjust the scale. I don't want the scale to go down, but if I go too far down, it's going to, that repetition is going to get really obvious. I chose there is a tile texture without missing tiles, but I really liked that this one felt more beat up. So that's good. I am looking at seams, and I think what I'd like to do is position this so that this black tile was right where these pipes meet. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to, looks like we need to scale this up for 1. So I'm going to click across all of them, hold down Shift and drag to the left. So we're going to need to go do something like that, 1.84. Then we can move this down in the Y direction, hold down Shift again. and somewhere between 0.01 and 0.02. So let's try 0.015. Okay, and looks like it can go a little bit lower. It's not perfect. At the same time, yeah, I suppose we can make this a little bit smaller still. So let's make it a little bit larger actually. 0.71. Why not? That's a nice odd number. And we'll move this back down. Okay, yeah, that works. Now let's take a look around. I want to shift this over to the left a little bit because of where these edges are lining up. So we'll shift it in the X direction. Maybe do something like that. Trying to figure out how I want this to line up. Ooh, I kind of like that. Yeah, I like that. I don't love how these edges are lining up here. I'm getting picky again, but it happens. There we go. I will live with that. All right, let's take a look at this in rendered view, see how we're doing. Okay, so now we can see the difference that having a metallic texture creates. So we get these lovely highlights coming from the pylon lights, which you can't really see the pylons lit from this angle, but you can see the result of them, and I love that little subtle glow we get. We also see on the edges of everything is catching the highlight from all of our signs and our lights, so we get those. You can see how this red top-down light is catching as well. We get these nice red horizontal lines. We can see the glowing from the cables draped across it. I really like what it does. However, I think the metallic might be a little bit too high. Or not, I'm sorry, not the metallic, the roughness. I think it needs to be a little bit rougher. I want it to stay metallic. And remember, usually, unless we have a metallic texture, but the metallic value is either going to be 0 or 1, rarely anything in between. But the roughness is a little bit much. So what we can do is we can add an additional node to adjust that. And I mean, I'll cover it here, but I do want to call out, once again, the wonderful, helpful CG bookcase. I don't have, it's like I might have closed that window. But if we go to, again, I'll link to this. But if we go to the, it's not in the about, I think it's in the learn. Can't remember exactly where I found it. That's why I saved the link, so I wouldn't have to do this. Here it is. Okay. Some textures, how to use Pbr textures. So he calls this out as well, and it's this gamma node. And so what this allows us to do is adjust the roughness in our scene, in that image texture. So I'm going to go back in here, and I'm going to hit Shift A. We're going to add in a, I believe it's a converter? No. It is a color, gamma. Okay, I'm just going to drop that right on the line between the roughness and the principled shader. And now we can, I got to remember which way is which. Lower gamma value means rougher surface, and vice versa. So if we want to increase the roughness, we need to lower the gamma value. And if we Control-Shift-click on it, we can see here's the default roughness. And as we lower the gamma, it's going to essentially brighten the image. As we increase the gamma, it's going to darken the image. So by default, it's at 1. I'm going to hold down Shift and drag. Actually, let me go back to our shader. So Control-Shift-click on the principled shader so we can see the final result here. Okay. And here is 1. Might be more obvious if we look up here. So we can see how diffuse these reflections of the cables are. And if we go to 0.5, see how much more spread out that is, and we're getting more of that haze from the lights. So we can kind of figure out which one we like the best. I'm going to cheat a little bit. Instead of me pushing nodes back and forth, I'm just going to go to my other file, click on it, and see what I did before. Oh, I used a multiply node before. I did 1.4, so that's not helpful at all. But I think probably maybe 0.8, just to make it a little bit rougher. I think that works. And I didn't do anything else before. No, just want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yeah, so it's a little bit rougher. Maybe we'll go 0.85. Okay, so that works. And we can see how this surface responds to different angles as well. So it looks one thing when we're looking at it straight on, but if we start rotating around, we're going to get more of that highlight. Okay, and then as we do that, we can kind of look here and we can look at this sign and we can decide that, oh, maybe this emission strength is too much on the sign. So maybe I'm going to bring the value here down to like 60 or 40 and bring that down. I'm also going to bring this down to 1. Yeah, okay. I think that works a little bit better. Great. So there's that wall. Let's move on to this wall. And again, get rid of the test grid, add a new material. I'm going to call this one brick wall. Not Brock Wall. I don't know who Brock is. I'm sure he's a great guy. Brick wall. And add our texture. So Control-Shift-T. And I've already found a brick texture. This one isn't square, but we're just gonna say that that's fine, because that's fine. Let's check our inputs here real quick. That's color. In the roughness, we have the roughness texture. The normal, we have the normal texture, and in displacement, we have displacement. I am going to use displacement for this. I'm also going to set my IOR to 1.6. Let me make sure that that's set for the wall. You're not really going to notice it much on a solid thing. It's IOR is really going to come into play when we start dealing with glass and translucency, transparency. Okay, so here's our texture. Let's go to our material preview. Okay, so obviously that's enormous. So let's fix that. Let's grab our scale and drag this up until we get a size that we like. Okay, and now we can see that a lot of these bricks, we pull up the image here. Go to our image editor and open up our brick color. And I'm going to go into local view here, go into front view, and you can start to see that repeating pattern, so we need to be careful about that. But if we compare these bricks, okay, because this is not a square texture, it's not lining up square. All right. So the kind of quick way that I'm going to fix this is I'm just going to adjust the scale in the X direction. I'm going to Control Shift, I'll drag it down until it feels closer. So something like that, I think. I think that works right there. Okay, and this, by using non-square textures is generally not great. All right, so we've got that. Now we still need to adjust the scale. I'm going to get out of local view. So we can see, actually, in local view, when we're just looking at the wall, we can see this repeating pattern, right? It becomes pretty obvious, especially as we zoom out. But when we add a bunch of junk in front of it, it's a lot harder to tell that there's a repeating texture. Now, that definitely works in our favor. Let's also bring our little stand-in over here. I should probably give him a name instead of just calling him Guy. Or maybe Guy is his name. That's a perfectly fine name. All right. So we can kind of use that to compare, figure out how the bricks feel. Now maybe we move him over here. Compare the size of a brick to the size of his face. Those are pretty big bricks. Let's scale that down a little bit. So I'll grab the wall again, go to my scale. I'm going to select them all, hold down Shift, and drag. Make it a little bit smaller. Okay. So that works pretty well. Let's look at this in rendered view. Okay, it's dark for one. We do need to fix the normal map. That's going to create a pretty big difference, especially if we look up here. I'll grab these nodes, move them over. Shift A, add a Rgb Curves node. Go to the green channel and reverse it. There we go. Okay. Now, if the strength feels a little too high, we can adjust it here. I'm okay with it. I like kind of rocky, craggy texture of this, and I love how it works in contrast to the smooth, sleek metal. Yeah, so this works pretty well on its own. You don't necessarily need a displacement modifier. Go to this scene world so we can see this with a little bit more light to it. We look like from back here, I'll just do this region. I'm going to zoom in here. From back here, it looks pretty good. It's going to take a second to kind of load and resolve, but it looks fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. However, the reason why I think we need a displacement modifier on this is when we look at this from another view. So if we come over here, you see that normal map is doing a lot of work, as is the reflectivity. But if we come over here, and I'm just going to focus on this top part of the vending machine so that I can move the camera in. This is a really kind of bumpy, craggy wall, but the seam is still perfectly straight. And I don't like that. I want the seam to have some life to it. I want it to kind of be bumpy and craggy like the rest of the wall. And so this is where having just a normal map doesn't quite cut it. All right, so I'm going to select that wall, and we're going to do the same normal map steps that we did before. I'm going to go to my material properties, settings, displacement, and bump. Okay. Got our displacement node right here, so we'll focus on that. We'll go to our modifiers, add in a subsurface modifier, set it to active subdivision, and it looks like we've got some distortion here. And that's because, shame on me, I don't have any holding edges. Excuse me. So, let's add some holding edges. We'll just go here real quick. Do that, and that, and that. We'll just do this all the way around real quick. I should have done this earlier. But sometimes you forget when there's a lot going on. And that's okay. We'll add that right up in there, and we need to add 2 in here. And then we need to add 1 right here. Okay. So that's good. Oh, we need to also add them here. Slide that up. Oh, okay, I don't think that one added. Try that again. There we go. Okay, so now that's looking much better. And got our adaptive subdivision set. So now what we can do is I'm going to actually go into local view for this and go to rendered view so we can see the effects of our displacement modifier. And again, lots of displacement. Too much displacement. Let me also make sure this is shade smooth. Okay. Also, while I think about it, go back to material preview. Can't remember if I set the grounds to shade smooth. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Okay. Back into local view, back into rendered view. I need to bring this scale way down. We try 0.05 maybe. And we'll talk about this corner here in a second. But I want to focus on this area first. And you can see we're getting some weird artifacting. Let's bring the viewport levels up. That definitely helps. It's still going out too much. Let's try 0.03. That seems to work for everything else, so why not try it here? And yeah, that's pretty good. 0.02. I think that's better. I think 0.02 is going to be what we go with. Now, we have an issue. And that's the corner right here. And what's happening here, you can see there's an artifact of some sort. What's happening is we have the grout here is being pushed in by the displacement modifier. So it's getting pushed in here, and it's getting pushed in on the side that way. And so what it's doing is it's creating an overlap in the geometry where it's trying to push in past itself. And that's what happens when we get that. So what we can do to fix that is we can adjust our mid-level. So if we bring the mid-level down, it's going to basically make, if we've set the mid-level to 0, it's going to make black the mid point. So everything from then on will get pushed out, right? So instead of everything below, 0.5 getting pushed in, now we're at 0. So everything below 0 is going to get pushed in. And since nothing is below 0, the answer to the question of how much more black can you be, the none more black, can't get less than 0 as far as light is concerned. So there's no light. So that's not going to go anywhere. All right. That, by the way, was a reference to Spinal Tap for all of you youngins listening that have never seen Spinal Tap. See it, it's amazing. Okay, so we bring our mid-level down, and that fixes our corners. Corners look really good now. All right, so let's get out a local view and see how that affects the rest of our geometry. Add period to kind of zoom in on it. And let's look at kind of these objects here and make sure that we're not getting weird collision things. We are a little bit, not too bad. And look at our vending machine. I mean, generally speaking, we have enough of a buffer here that I think it's working. Yeah, I think that's working. But it's always good to check and just make sure that the displacement isn't pushing things around too much. Okay. So there's that. We're going to go back to Material Preview. And we'll change back to our more accurate shading. That's looking really good. I'm happy with that. So we can keep going with this. I'm going to add in an old iron material to the truss. So I think that looks really good. So I'm at an hour 17. I'm going to try to finish this up in the next 10 minutes. So I'm going to speed through the next couple of materials because they're all going to be very similar. I'm not going to use displacement for anything else in the scene, at least not at this time. I don't need to. But I'm going to grab this truss piece and same sort of thing here. We're going to get rid of... Oh, I actually gave it its own material already. Okay, so that's good. That'll save me one step. And I found a very good old iron texture. And it's either called iron old or old iron. It's like it's old iron. There it is, old iron 1. We've got color, height, metallic, normal, and roughness. We will grab all of them, import that set. It's going to take a second. There it goes. And just even the default is just awesome and gross and nasty. I'm going to delete the displacement node and the displacement texture because I'm 100% sure I'm not going to need it. I'm going to move these nodes out. Let's check real quick and make sure that we have, yep, that's base color. Metallic is metallic. Good there. Roughness is the roughness. And normal is the normal. Again, it's usually the metallic node that has issues. I think if it's not named correctly, because the add-on is looking for specific file names, I believe. If it's not named correctly, it'll pull in the base color and it'll get weird. So gotta watch out for that. And then we'll add in our... Actually, I'm going to do this in this view so we can kind of see the effect right away. But let's add in... Yeah, we'll just do it like this. Okay. Shift A, add color, Rgb Curves. green channel, and whoops, so I accidentally added that, so let's get rid of that. And go there, and there. Okay, so that fixes that. And just to see the before and after, I'll mute it, and fixed. Okay. Now let's go to our mapping, because this is a little bit too intense. We need to scale this down. And again, I'm just gonna cheat here and see what I did before. Save everybody a little bit of time. Looks like I set it to 5. Okay, so let's do that. Let's set our scale to 5. Great. Yeah, that definitely feels better. It's feeling a little bit shiny, I think, for my taste. I want this to be a little bit rougher, so that's where I added in the gamma here on the roughness. So Shift-A, color gamma. Pop that right on there on the roughness line. And set that to 0.75. It's going to roughen that up just a little bit. We could maybe even go lower. 0.65. Okay. And I'm looking at this in Material Preview, which gives me a pretty good representation. We can always double check the final version in the rendered view. But the last thing that I want to do is I think I want to maybe make it a little bit darker. Go into rendered view. Take a second to update. You can see as we add more textures, the render starts to take longer, so be aware of that. I'm going to Control B and set my border region here so I can just focus on that. Okay. Yeah, I think I want that to be darker, so I'm going to hit Shift-A, and I'm going to add in another Rgb Curves. Oops, not a mix node. Get out of here. Color, Rgb Curves. And I'm just going to leave it here. I'm just going to change the whole thing. I'm going to add in a node right about here and just drag it down. That's just going to darken things up a bit. Yeah, I think that works. Okay. Like that, let's Control Shift B. Get out of that. And let's just look and see how we're doing overall. All right, sorry about that. I had my screen capture just stopped recording for no apparent reason. But as I was saying, I was going to check this in rendered view and see how we were doing. And there we go. Let's make sure we set this to scene world so we can see our actual scene. Looking really good. So it's the same process for the rest of the scene. Adding your textures, deciding if you want displacement. You can, again, adjust if you want to adjust the roughness or the overall tone. Please do that. And just kind of play around. It's really easy to download a bunch of different textures and try them out. All you have to do is swap the material slots here. Right, so if I decided, I wonder what it would look like if I swapped these walls and I made this one the brick and this one the metal. Well, you just select the wall on the right and you change the material from metal tiles to brick wall, and now you've got brick over there. Okay, so that's super easy to do and try out a bunch of different things. One thing that I did do, just kind of as a temporary sort of thing, is if I go to this UV test grid, I'm going to get rid of that and add a new material, and I'm going to call this, let's call this plain metal. And let's bring in some textures for it. And I've got a bunch of different metal here. I've got galvanized steel, I've got metal plates and woven metal. Let's see what this just basic metal is. Yeah, this is the one that I want. Just basic metal. Select all the textures and import it. I'm going to get rid of the displacement node and the displacement texture. Let's check our textures and make sure we got the base color in the right place. See, okay, here we go. The metallic is actually the color. See what the file name is, the color. If we Control Shift click on it, see that it is in fact the color map. So what we need to do is load up our actual Metalness shader. Click on that. And then when you add a new texture, it resets the color space to sRGB. And because this is not a color map, this is the metallic map, we want to change that to non-color. So we've got that. Let's see why is this completely black? I don't know. It shouldn't be. Set that to non-color. Our roughness is good, and our normal map is good. Okay, let me maybe jump to solid and jump back. That doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. You might be missing something here. Metallic. It's the metalness. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. Come back to that. Let's fix the normal map first. Go in here, and again, we'll add in our color, Rgb Curves. Right in there, go to the green channel and reverse it. I am losing my voice. That's right, we're almost done. Okay, so we've reversed that, and figure out why this isn't working. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just hit X and delete that entirely. I'm going to go to my roughness, Shift D to duplicate it, reconnect the vector, and connect the color to the metalness, load up our metalness image, and we still have a very dark, go to local view here. Let's change this to that one. Okay. Also feeling a little leather-like, but I think that has to do with the shader. Let me rename this to Metalness. Yeah, everything's fine. It's just the actual, if we look at the color map, it's just darker than I thought it was. I thought it was a lighter thing. So that's fine. All right, so we can get out of the local view here. And there's our metal. And that's probably actually too dark. So there's a couple things that we can try. But I'm going to just kind of look through my texture library here. And see, I've got some metal plates. I've got galvanized steel, which actually I know I don't want that one. I've got a brushed steel. So yeah, okay, I think this is what we're going to use. I want to make it a little bit lighter. I'm going to go to my base color here. We can go into local view on this so we can kind of see it clearly. And I'm going to hit Shift A and add in let's do curves. I like using curves to adjust color. So I'm going to add it in there. Control Shift click on the curves node so that the viewer is also looking at that node. And then let's just bring it up a little bit. Just kind of a general adjustment there. You can go like kind of far with it. So let's see, what does that look like rendered? And we'll connect to the principal BSDF and turn off scene world so we can kind of see that. Yeah, I think that's working better. I'm also going to increase the scale. That might be too much. Let's go to like 2.1. Okay. So we've got that. Let's get out of local view here. And there's our metal. Now what I want to do is I want to apply this metal. Actually, I'm going to first change the name. I'm going to say plain metal underscore light. Because I've lightened it up a little bit. Once we have that, I'm going to grab the rest of these textures and change them to this plain metal light as well. Grab this object, and we'll change that. Grab these two, and I will change that. These I'm going to actually make a different material. And then these two, this one, actually got to do them one at a time. change this to plain metalite and this one as well to plain metalite. Okay. And I'll do something different for the bolts. And once I have that, I want to add a little bit of additional contrast because right now I'm putting it all at the same material. Doesn't quite work for me. Kind of lose what's going on. So it's actually getting weird here. What's going on? There we go. Okay. So what I'm going to do is on, let's say these pieces. I'll start with this one. I'm going to copy the material, and I'll just leave it as a copy for now because I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to adjust this. I'm going to Control X and get rid of the curves. It's going to make it darker. But I don't think I want that. Well, maybe I do. Maybe we'll leave this dark, just as an example. So now this one is darker, and now if we go to our rendered view, Control B, add a border, and now let's look at the render. We'll see how this affects it. Okay, I just want to zoom in on it. There we go. Yeah, that looks all right. Now we can also adjust the roughness here if we want. I'll probably actually find a different metallic texture, but it's going to be the same sort of thing. Just want to demonstrate that you could take the same material and just adjust it in different ways using the same textures and get a different result and add additional contrast to your scene. So go ahead and keep playing around with that. Try a bunch of different things. And there's a really cool kind of braided metal texture that you can get for these cables that I used. So if we add that real quick as the last thing, I promise. Braided metal. And Control-Shift-T. Navigate to our metal weave. We've got a bunch of different options here. I don't need the ambient occlusion. Let's go here. Principal texture set. Again, we're going to delete displacement because I'm not going to worry about displacement here. Let's check our textures. Okay, you can see the metallic is got the base color, so that's wrong. So let's grab our metallic texture and make sure we set that to non-color. Our roughness is roughness. Our normal is normal, but we don't have our base color, so I'm going to duplicate our metallic node, and then we will connect this up, connect the color to our color, and I hit N and rename this to color. Okay, now we can load up our base color image. Make sure that that loaded. Did change the color space to sRGB. We'll add in our normal map curve so we can invert that. Okay, I'll hit N to close that. Control space to get out of that. Okay, so here is our material. Now we need to adjust the scale. So I'm just going to click and drag and bring that scale down. Yeah, I think something like that is really good. So now we got this really cool braided metal texture that looks awesome when it starts catching the light. Okay, so again, play around. And nothing is final at this point. It's just trying to develop whatever that look is that we're going for. So enjoy, have fun, and then don't have class next week, as a reminder. So in 2 weeks, we'll come back and we'll talk about starting to add some grunge and some grime and some dirt to this scene to make it feel a little bit more real and lived in. So I will see you then. Actually, there might be one video before then, but we'll see.